My name is Paul Poiker, and I am archivist and director at the Moravian Archives in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. I'm glad you have all joined us today for the lecture by Marita Gruner. I'm speaking to you from our exhibit space, where we are currently showing the exhibit Zinzendorf in America. This exhibit was made possible with the kind support of the Consulate General of Germany in New York. Zinzendorf was the leader of the Moravian Church who visited Pennsylvania from 1741 until 1743. But Zinzendorf did not travel alone. One of the people that came with him was his oldest daughter, Benigna. Benigna is remembered, especially here in Bethlehem, because of her role in founding Moravian education in America. The next issue of the Journal of Moravian History contains a translation of the diary that she kept while traveling in North America. Benigna visited North America again in 1748 and in 1783. Today's lecture will take a closer look at the letters Benigna von Zinzendorf wrote during her travels to America. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. After the lecture, the speaker is happy to take a few questions. This lecture is going to be recorded. In order to protect your privacy, everybody's video is turned off. Please make sure you stay muted. Our speaker today is Marita Gruner. Marita Gruner is a research assistant at the University of Greifswald in Germany. And for the past few years, she has been working on a dissertation on the correspondence of the three Zinzendorf daughters. She will defend her dissertation next month, and we wish her all the best for that. Today, Frau Gruner will be speaking live from Germany on Benigna von Zinzendorf in America. Join me in welcoming Marita Gruner.
Thank you very much for the invitation and that I was granted to speak to you tonight or today about the oldest daughter of Count von Zinzendorf. I wrote my doctoral thesis about Benigna von Zinzendorf, married von Watteville, and therefore it is a particular pleasure for me to bring it closer to you today. That's why I jump right into the matters with her trips to North America. For a woman in the 18th century, Benigna traveled from Europe to New York to North America quite often, namely 3 times. So, excuse me, I have to get the next slide. In the chart, I have shown the lifetimes of Count and Countess von Zinzendorf, their 3 daughters, Benigna von Watteville, Maria Agnes zu Dohna, cited in red, and Elisabeth von Watteville, along with their families, husbands, and children, so that we can get an overview of the lifetimes along with the view of the 3 travels of Benigna. The first journey from 1741 to 1743 did Benigna together with her father, Count von Zinzendorf. The second trip, together with her newlywed husband, Johannes von Watteville, in 1748. Before Benigna made her third trip to North America in 1783, there were some changes in her family. Count and Countess von Zinzendorf died, and Benigna's sisters had married and became mothers. Benigna and Johannes had also had 4 children, and their older daughter, Anna Dorothea, had already married the widowed Hans Christian von Schweinitz and had emigrated to Bethlehem for this marriage. Anna Dorothea, her husband, and her children lived in Bethlehem and therefore are highlighted in red because they all saw each other again during the third trip by Benigna and her husband from 1783 to 1787. Since there are unfortunately no letters from Benigna's hand about the second trip, we will only deal with her first and her third trip today. For both of these journeys, letters written by Benigna have been preserved. With the help of these letters, it is easy to compare how Benigna described her trips to North America as a 16-year-old teenager and as an older woman of 58 years. She went on the first trip together with her father, Count von Zinzendorf. There is a special exhibition about this trip here in the archive, as well as an article by Thomas McCullough in the Journal of Moravian History, which will coming in November. In my doctoral thesis, I dealt with the life of Benigna from Wattewelle, but all above with her life as an adult married woman and mother, and thus focused on the third trip to North America. As Thomas McCullough has shown in his article, Benigna wrote letters from her first trip as a young woman or teenager, mostly to her mother, but also to her sisters from the Unread Sisters and Girls Choir, and to the whole community as well. A lot more letters are preserved from her last trip from 1783 to 1787. Almost all of them were addressed to her biological younger sister, Elisabeth von Wattewelle. Now we take a look at Benigna's first journey to North America. The trip was supposed to start when she was 15 years old. A few months earlier, she suffered a quote-unquote open damage to her leg, and there was fear of a quote-unquote cold burn, which is gangrene, and some doctors possibly wanted to amputate that affected foot. Despite this impairment, she wanted to and had to accompany her father on his trip to North America. It is emphasized on several occasions that her mother gave her consent to this. On October the 18th, 1741, the group left Falmouth, England, and arrived in New York on November 29. During the crossing, her leg recovered and was healed at the end of the cruise. They arrived in Philadelphia on December the 10th, 1741, and there Benigna had the particular pleasure of meeting Anna Nitschmann again. At first, Benigna couldn't speak English, but it was very important to her to learn the language because she felt a great urge to proclaim, quote, the death of Jesus, unquote, to others. Benigna's zeal in telling others about Jesus Christ had not remained idle, and other people noticed her commitment. She told others about the, quote, blood of the Lamb, unquote, and tried to do missionary work wherever she went. Her memoirs state that she built a school for girls in Germantown. Benigna wrote a letter from Germantown on May 30, 1742. Now the Lamb has put me back on a new post, namely I have 25 girls, and I willingly surrender to do it and don't want to rest until everyone has experienced something of the blood of Jesus in their hearts. Almost 2 weeks later, she sums up this time by telling that she had had more and more children in her group, about one more every day, until there were a total of 31. Now, my dear sisters, you couldn't believe what work it is just to make Pennsylvania children human. Yes, but the Lamb gave us grace that 12 among them have become quite agreeable. They were now in 2 rooms. In the upper room were the bad ones, and in the lower room the good ones. For a long time I was among the bad ones, until several weeks ago. I removed to the good ones. Yet nothing has stirred the bad ones, not a single good spark. Only one I have with me from the bad ones. I have 4, who I am taking with me to Bethlehem, and I hope that the Lamb will keep them. They are good little hearts and dear little witnesses of the Spirit. All the others I sent home. Although it then pained me too very much, I just didn't know of another way. I had to do it for the sake of the parents. So working with the children was not easy. Probably because of this report, she is considered as the founder of girls' education in North America, and the memory is still kept alive today, as Paul said. However, from her hand and in her memoirs, there is no report of her further work with the children. 2 months later, she mentions in a letter that she had, quote, a little white girl, unquote. That was the last time she mentioned her work with children. Benigna probably continued to lead the girls' choir in Bethlehem as she did in Germany. Benigna was looking forward to visiting what she called the quote-unquote savages and informed the community in Europe, quote, "I think the lamp will give me a few souls," unquote. With this goal, they traveled to Bethlehem in June 1742. Before that, they had mostly been in Philadelphia, Germantown, and Oley. I marked this in yellow at this map. At times, Benigna was out and about with other co-workers without her father. In July 1742, she and her father traveled from Bethlehem to the Native Americans in Nazareth and from there further into the Native American areas. She reported once that she had spoken to a Native American's wife who spoke English poorly. Benigna described a brother's speech to the natives, which was translated for the others by a local man who could understand English. In her words, quote, "The dear lamb gave our brother Zander grace to speak of his blood and death and pain," unquote. Benigna did not describe the effect on the Native Americans. In 1742, she spent several months in Bethlehem Parish. In January 1743, Benigna and her father traveled back to Europe. In January 1740, Benigna's letter from the years in North America show great zeal for the cause of the Lord and great enthusiasm for the adventurous journeys in a foreign land. She expressed her horror at conceited saints who she believed were many in Pennsylvania. Furthermore, she addressed her being a sinner and her closeness to God and asked the people she wrote to for intercession for her service. She appears as a committed co-worker and describes the various activities in the Moravian congregation, which were communions, conferences, baptisms, weddings, appointments, and so on. In her letters from this period, Benigna spoke of Christ as the quote-unquote lamb, in German words Lamm or Lämmlein. 3 years after this first trip, on the night of May the 20th to the 21st, 1746, during the Synod in Zeist, the Netherlands, Benigna von Zinzendorf was married to Johannes von Watteville. She had 4 children with Johannes. Johann Ludwig, born 1752, died 1784. Anna Dorothea, born 1754 and died 1813. Maria Justina, born 1762, died 1828. And their youngest son, Christian Friedrich, born 1766 and died 1786. Benigna had given all of her children to the Brothers Congregation Children's Asylum in Herrnhut when they were 1 year old or when they were 2 years old at the latest. For her, the early delivery was an expression of the fact that she had consecrated her children to the Lord from birth. In addition, her own service to the Lord, which consisted of many journeys, had priority over family coexistence. Very unexpectedly, the lot for the visit to North America came in 1782. And so the preparations for Benigna's third trip to North America began. Because of her age, she didn't expect that they would be assigned for such a long journey. Benigna was 58 and Johannes 63 years old. And they themselves, their children, and their sisters were probably quite astonished by this assignment. On September 27, 1783, the group of Johannes and Benigna, their servant Georg Sponer, Justine G. Graf, and the married couple Anna Johanna and Johann Daniel Köhler traveled from Texel to New York. The passage, which usually lasted a few weeks, was made very difficult by the weather. They fought through 63 storms, of which, according to Benigna's testimony, 13 were so bad that the sailors expected the ship to sink. When they reached the North American coast, after 7 unsuccessful attempts, there were strong headwinds, they had to give up the plan to enter the port of New York. The captain decided on January 22nd, 1784, after 4 months at sea, to head for the next southern port on St. Thomas. Since such a long journey had not been planned, supplies and especially water became scarce. Everyone was given a quart of beer per day, plus salted pork, beef, and hard ship's bread. The food increased the thirst too, so that all passengers were weakened. On January the 22nd, they had received a barrel of water from a passing ship, and on January 23rd and 24th, heavy rain fell, which they collected in all kinds of containers, with which they could fill 4 barrels. On February the 17th, at 2 a.m., the ship ran aground on a sandbank near the island of Barbados. They were shipwrecked. When boarding the lifeboats, Johannes got into the water up to his waist and sat in the boat with wet clothes until they could finally get ashore in the late afternoon. Benigna was very worried that it would harm him. That Benigna could eat anything at all, Johannes had to chew the biscuit which was served in the lifeboats that day for Benigna, because she no longer had any teeth. No more teeth at the age of 58. She did not address her toothlessness in any other preserved source, but based on her story, it seems that she has had no teeth for a longer time. When they finally landed on the island, Barbados, the governor invited them into his house and took care of their rest and recovery. Benigna and Johannes crossing for a visit to North America and their shipwrecking of Barbados in 1784 were decisive for Benigna, Johannes, and the participating members of the journey because of the imminent threat of their lives. The shipwreck is not missing in any biography of them. Various reports of these events can be found in the archives. On February the 27th, with the help of the governor, they left Barbados and sailed for Antigua, from where they intended to travel on to Philadelphia. In the onward journey, there were further delays, so that they did not arrive in Philadelphia until May 29, 1784. As a reminder, their journey started on September the 27th, 1783. Benigna summed up the last few months. Well, the Savior will know best why he intended this difficult school for us. As long as we were in the middle of misery, it didn't bring us joy, while it will certainly carry out much for our own heart. Looking back, she did not attribute any happy or positive feelings to her experiences, but tried to find a previously hidden meaning in them, which, in her opinion, would hopefully show itself in her personal development in the future. From now on, Benigna and Johannes marked the anniversary of their shipwreck every year on February the 17th and gave thanks for their rescue. From Philadelphia, they traveled to Bethlehem and lived there together with their daughter, Anna Dorothea, married von Schwein. During the visitation from 1784 to 1787, they lived with Anna Dorothea and her family. When Benigna and Johannes arrived at their daughter's, she was in advanced pregnancy. But in addition to this, Anna Dorothea was able to introduce her parents to grandchildren, Ludwig David, born 1780, and Karl Heinrich, born 1782. Benigna was happy and at the same time very worried about her pregnant daughter. In the previous months of her pregnancy, she had to, in Benigna's words, quote unquote, swallow up a lot of fear for her parents, and Benigna therefore expected difficulties in the further pregnancy, during the delivery, and or in the puerperium. She was surprised that there were no complications. On July the 8th, 1784, 1 month after Benigna's arrival, Anna Dorothea gave birth to Justine Dorothea. Sadly, Justina Dorothea died 2 weeks later, on July 23rd, 1784. Benigna did not associate this early death with, quote, the Angst einschlucken, unquote, in English, quote, swallowing fear, unquote. It is noteworthy that Benigna apparently assumed that negative emotions could disrupt a pregnancy, but would have no effect on the newborn. Benigna gave an impressive description of the infant's illness and death. This death was a tragic event for Benigna and a hard blow for the young mother. 2 months later, Anna Dorothea complained to her aunt Elizabeth in the addendum to Benigna's letter, quote, "I am not yet comforted about my little Justina," unquote. So Anna Dorothea did not react indifferently or cold to the death of a baby. I emphasize this because some researchers believe that parents did not mourn their children much because of the generally high infant mortality rate in the 18th century. Anna Dorothea's statements contradict such a judgment. And to the great joy for everyone, Anna Dorothea gave birth to a healthy son, Christian Renatus, 3 years later in 1787. At about the same time, Benigna and her family in Bethlehem learned of the death of their sister and aunt Maria Agnes zu Dohna. Maria Agnes died on February the 17th, 1784, but the news of her death did not reach Bethlehem until 5 months later. Maria Agnes' day of death fell exactly on the day on which Benigna and Johannes were shipwrecked on the island of Barbados on their way to North America. The coincidence of these two events affected Benigna, and she wrote to Elizabeth, quote, "So now the two of us are left alone out of all the 12 children our parents had," unquote. Benigna reported about this in the same letter that described the death of her granddaughter Justina. Benigna was deeply moved by this death and wept for both of them. When she came back to write about the passing of Maria Agnes a few months later, she listens in detail how many children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren were now with their, quote, blessed parents before the throne of the Lamb, unquote. More deaths were to follow. During her stay in North America, she lost her own sons, Johann Ludwig and Christian Friedrich. On July the 23rd, 1784, Benigna's eldest son, Johann Ludwig, died in his missionary station in Trankebar. His parents only found out about his death on August the 9th, 1785, more than a year after his actual death. Benigna reacted to this news with calm but deep sadness. So let's take a look at Anna Dorothea's statement. About the passing of her brother, Anna Dorothea wrote the following to her aunt Elizabeth in an addendum to Benigna's letter. It was not at all unexpected to me that after his last letters, which he wrote to me in confidence, I suspected it, and almost would I have said wished. Thank him, however, for completing it in this way and not to bring him to Europe for a short time. But it was the first experience to deliver one of my siblings. My dear Papa was quite on the same page with the Savior's ways, and Mama has, through a miracle, put up with it. It is interesting that Johann Ludwig wrote confidential letters with his sister, but they are not preserved, and that he was supposed to return to Europe because of his illness, which never happened. And Anna Dorothea offers an outside view of her parents. And that Benigna was able to, quote, put up with it, unquote, in German, quote, sich reinfinden, unquote, is evident from the fact that she only wrote one letter about her deep mourning for Johann Ludwig. It was right in the same letter in which she told Elizabeth that they had received the news of Johann Ludwig's death. A year later, Benigna was shaken by the death of her youngest son. In June 1786, Benigna received news in Bethlehem that her youngest son, Christian, who was in Barbie, where he had been studying at the seminary since April 1784, was seriously ill, and that there was no longer any hope of recovery. This news hit Benigna hard, since she was still mourning the demise of Johann Ludwig. She feared for Christian and tried to come to terms with his possible death. I would like to pass my will over to my dear Saviour, but for nature it is very hard to bear, and it's hard for me to give up all my sons, because this last one was such a hopeful young person. I ask the Saviour to strengthen me, that when the news of its real departure comes, I can calm down. It has affected me and my husband very much. The hut also feels a lot because I have hardly forgotten the pain about my Johann Ludwig, so I got a pounding heart again. Now the Saviour will know what he's doing. I don't want to grumble in that respect, but I know my good Saviour certainly doesn't mind that we are grieving in pain. Well, enough of that. I can't write much because of my teeth. Indeed, the reports on these deaths, quote, sich fassen können, unquote, as an expression of emotion management is important. Benigna hopes that when the news of the actual death of her son Christian arrives, she will contain or control herself. The quote, sich fassen können, unquote, described the desired degree of emotional control. On the one hand, to feel a justified grief and live it out vividly, and on the other hand, not to be overwhelmed by it, or even to be tempted to an accusation of God's decision. In the next letter to her sister Elisabeth, she dealt with the death of the 19-year-old Christian. She had learned shortly before that he had succumbed to the disease on April 2nd, 1786. The fact that her two sons had died brought Benigna into great emotional distress, and you can tell from her letters that she struggled with her Saviour for the acceptance of his ways. Her grief broke out several times in the following letters. One example: how many tears still roll down my cheeks, sometimes when I consider that this dear, hopeful child will complete his run so soon, and I believe it will take time for this wound to be healed. Although I don't want to and cannot gripe against my dear Lord. It is a deeply cutting pain, but the Saviour always comforts me when it seems too hard for me sometimes. That I have lost both of my sons one after the other in such a short time. And then I often call to my dearest and best friend, just leave us our two daughters. Well, enough of these matters because my heart is getting too soft. Emotion and body sensation were closely linked, which is shown in her picture of, quote, deeply cutting pain, unquote, and the wound that is difficult to heal. In this highly emotional situation, her emotional management becomes clear. She merely wrote that it, quote, sometimes seems hard to her, unquote, and turns her concern for her daughters into a prayer. The formula, quote, well, enough of this, unquote, concludes her remarks on her mourning so as not to go into any further depth and possibly to be tempted to make regulated statements. After writing, quote, well, enough of this, unquote, she changed the subject. Despite these tragic family events, I don't want to forget to mention that Benigna and Johannes were commissioned to visit the North American congregations. Benigna and Johannes had a lot of work to do in the North American churches, and they traveled between different communities, primarily those around Bethlehem, Nazareth, Lititz, Philadelphia, Heidelberg, Lancaster, Yorktown, and others. For 9 months, they were in the remote areas of North Carolina in the so-called, quote-unquote, Wachau. The purpose for the visitation trips to and in North America was to, quote, synodal arranging, unquote, of the various congregations and the, quote-unquote, speaking of all congregation members. In North America, the main purpose of quote-unquote speaking was to find capable co-workers because there was a great shortage of co-workers in these communities. And Benigna repeatedly reports on these tasks and problems in her letters. In addition to these thematic questions, her letters also repeatedly revolve around her husband's state of health and his associated ability to work. Her letters seem to give an account of how long and how much Johannes worked and when he was really too sick to work. She wrote a little less often about her own illnesses. This is where the reports from her daughter Anna Dorothea came into play. In addition to her children, Anna Dorothea looked after her parents. She took on the role of carer for her old and frail mother and father. From this perspective, Anna Dorothea wrote the following addendum to one letter where she seemed to pour out her heart to her Aunt Elizabeth. God helped them on the bus journey. I am often perplexed about them and almost even more about my mom than my dad. Who in all his circumstances can still get into such difficulties? And mom still has trouble, fear, and grief enough about papa. Her food was bad again, and then she had a bad rush on her head. But she writes me that both is better now. I wish it is very much so, because it's impossible to think about care on such a trip. The so-called bus journey, unquote, meant their journey in the remote areas of North Carolina. Benigna had not reported anything about her illnesses. Anna Dorothea's words show that Benigna was burdened by her worries about Johannes. Anna Dorothea provides an outside view of the roads between Johannes and Benigna. For Benigna, her husband's health was paramount, and her own health was only important insofar as it should not prevent her husband from performing his services. The mentioned journey to North Carolina began in September 1785. They started their journey through Lititz and Graceham, and they traveled with a co-worker, a servant, and a female cook, and by carriage and stayed in tents a few times. They arrived in Salem in September and spent several months there visiting the Habara and Bethany. In February 1786, they visited the English Hope, Friedberg, and Heardland from Salem. They returned to Bethlehem in April 1786 via Friedrichstown, Grayson, Yorktown, Lititz, and Lancaster. They arrived in Bethlehem in May 1786. These approximately 9 months were the longest period of separation from their daughter Anna Dorothea. From then on, they lived in Bethlehem again until they returned to Europe. The farewell between the parents and Anna Dorothea's family in North America in June 1787 was final. Almost everyone involved was aware of this. Benigna talked about her pains to leave the little grandchildren who did not yet understand what this farewell meant. The farewell to our dear grandchildren was very sad. The 2 little ones, Karl and Christel, didn't understand it, but Ludwig cried a lot, and we too. Our dear children went on board with us, and there we sadly said goodbye. You can easily imagine how we felt when we gave our children a last kiss. Until then, the Dorel had held on, but it broke loose when they left the ship. She said to the captain, "Take care of my old parents." And he said, "You may depend, I will do what is in my power." And he has faithfully done that. The journey back from North America was completely unproblematic for Benigna and Johannes. In August 1787, they arrived in Barbie. Finally, I want to focus on the similarities and differences in the subject matter and the language of the letters from her visits as a teenager and as an older woman. In the synopsis of Benigna's letters from these years in North America, it can be seen that for Benigna the third trip had a completely different focus than the first trip to this part of the world. The finest day in North America was the only time in both lives when Benigna and Johannes had some kind of family life as parents. This new form of living with the family was reflected in the letters. The children and grandchildren are a constant and recurring theme. Benigna took a large part in their development. Benigna could assume that her sister Elisabeth, as a relative, had the same interest in the well-being of this young family. Anna Dorothea emphasized in her memoirs that these years spent together with her parents were important and quote unquote lovely for her because she had, in her words, quote, never before enjoyed being with my dear parents in such a family-like way, unquote. The way of life, and thus the main subject of her letters, differed fundamentally between the first and the third trip of Benigna. The way of working was also different. While Benigna was still fully focused on the mission in 1742, in 1784 she acted entirely in the structures of the now institutionalized community. Her main concern was no longer to tell people about Christ himself, but rather to make sure that at first her husband was able to do his services, second, the congregation had enough co-workers, and third, that everything was going well and properly in the congregation. Furthermore, Benigna's religious language had also changed. While Benigna always and often referred to Christ as Lamb, Bridegroom, or Blood Bridegroom, bridegroom in German Blutbräutigam, in the letters from the first journey, in the letters from 1783 to 1787, she always referred to Christ as quote unquote Savior, in German Heiland, or quote unquote friend, but never as lamb or bridegroom. On the one hand, the choice of words indicates that the use of language within the brethren has changed. That is, the terminology of blood and wounds had decreased. On the other hand, Benigna's change to a choice of words indicates that the relationship to Christ had become somewhat less emotional and changed into a more steady and stable foundation of life. Perhaps this simply reflects the change of perspective that has occurred through her life experience of growing from a teenage girl to a mature woman. The last slide, I want to show you the sources I used, and thank you very much.